Charlie Rose, they have a table separating interviewer and interviewee, but we'll do our best here. So we've just learned, Raj, that you were, as of 2012, you served as the general counsel of the National Security Agency. You came to that job from the White House. Give us a sense of what it's like to be the top lawyer of the NSA.
Well, it was a lot different for the past few years than I think it has been in the past. I did come out of the White House, and I was in a role called Staff Secretary for the President, which is a glorified title for the person who manages all the paper that goes to the President. And that is a very grind of a job, 24/7 sort of job. So I came to NSA with the idea that maybe I would restore some balance to my life, and that didn't prove to be the case, obviously. But I think there's one thing that surprised me is the operational tempo of the legal office at NSA. Not only is it a foreign intelligence agency, but it's a combat support agency, which means providing real-time intelligence to men and women on the field, on the battlefield around the world. And so that means that lawyers need to be in the rhythm of their client. And so the Office of General Counsel not only provides advice to that mission, that's about 100 lawyers or so a mid-size in-house legal office, but like any general counsel's office, provides advice on a range of issues. NSA, in addition to the Foreign Intelligence Mission, has something called an Information Assurance Mission, which is basically a cyber defense mission for computer systems and telecommunication systems called national security systems. Basically, the communication systems that support the military and support the intelligence community. So there's a lot of advice to be provided on that front as well, and across the whole host of legal issues you could imagine: acquisition, government contracting, intellectual property. There's a lot of very smart people thinking of very creative things that need to be patented at the agency, and so it's a pretty vibrant legal office.
Now, you've used a very, I think, interesting and in some sense strange phrase to capture the NSA and lawyering at the NSA. Namely, you refer to the NSA and maybe to the intelligence business more broadly as a regulated business, as a regulated industry. In what sense is the NSA a regulated business?
So let me start with an anecdote, which I think will lead to this point. When I accepted the job at NSA, I was not a surveillance expert or Fourth Amendment expert. I had a background in national security generally. So like most of us, when you're thinking about taking a new job, you're a little anxious. I talked to a number of mentors and colleagues around town in DC. Is this something I should be nervous about doing? And I got two pieces of completely contradictory advice, both of which turned out to be spectacularly wrong, but not for the reason that you'll think in a minute. So the first piece of advice was, don't be nervous at all. Everything they do is secret, so if you mess up, nobody's ever going to know. And the second piece of advice was, you should be really nervous because everything they do is secret, and you're the last line of defense. If you approve something, some huge operation is going to happen, and if it goes wrong, everyone's going to look at you through the lens of history. Now, both of those pieces of advice were very wrong, not because Snowden would come along and there would be a lot more public discussion about NSA, which did happen, of course, but because, as Sam referenced, NSA actually is a highly regulated entity. And I would make the case that it's one of the most highly regulated enterprises in the world, which I think runs contrary to what most people think of when they think of a spy agency. So what do I mean by that? Let me give you a sense of what the world looked like from the chair in which I sat as a GC at NSA. I think of concentric circles of regulation. So within the agency itself, we have all the offices you would expect: a chief compliance officer, a chief privacy and civil liberties officer, and an independent inspector general. Okay, so that's all within our bureaucratic structure, much like, frankly, many private enterprises at some level. But NSA is part of the Pentagon and also part of the intelligence community. Now, each of those departments has all those same officials. There's a general counsel of the Defense Department, chief privacy officer, policy officials, and inspector general, all of whom have jurisdiction over NSA, and all the same officials in the intelligence community working for the Director of National Intelligence. So that's layer 2. You go outside of that layer, still within the executive branch, and you have the Department of Justice. Now, the Department of Justice not only represents the intelligence community before the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, which is the court that hears applications for FISA warrants and so forth, but it also has an oversight role. For example, every 60 days under a program called the PRISM program. This is one of the programs exposed by Edward Snowden that there's a great deal of discussion about, which is fundamentally about targeting the communications of foreign citizens outside the US. That's what this program is about. Every 60 days, a team of lawyers from the Justice Department and the Director of National Intelligence show up at the NSA and look at every single tasking decision made under that legal authority. So literally looking over all the paperwork that was done contemporaneously for every single email address or telephone number that is put on surveillance. And again, we're talking about non-US people outside the US, so there's not necessarily a Fourth Amendment implication here. Every 60 days, going through all the paperwork. So that's just one example of sort of the type of oversight. So this is just layer 3, that's the Justice Department. Outside the Justice Department, of course, you have the White House, which post 9/11 has paid a lot of attention to the surveillance community with the terrorist surveillance program under President Bush and of course some of these programs under President Obama. And that means the National Security Council, and it means something called the President's Intelligence Oversight Board, which is a group of officials that every president picks to conduct oversight over the intelligence community. And every 3 months, I would sign out a report to the IOB, the Intelligence Oversight Board, along with our Inspector General, that cataloged every single mistake made in NSA contrary to statute, rule, or regulation anywhere in the world. And now these reports are now mostly public, so you're welcome to take a look at them. They are terribly boring reading because it is something as simple as an analyst in XYZ country mistyped a query contrary to whatever the relevant rule or policy is. That gets audited and reported up and rolled up into this ridiculously long quarterly report that goes to the White House every quarter. So all of what I just described is all in the executive branch alone. Now, of course, outside the executive branch, you have the Congress. And as you'd expect, NSA reports to the intelligence committees in the Senate and the House. But since it's part of the Defense Department, it also reports to the Armed Services Committees in both Congresses, in both houses. And since it involves surveillance, which could affect Americans, it reports to the Judiciary Committees. And since cyber is a huge part of its mission, it reports to the Homeland Security Committees. That's 8 of the most prominent committees in both houses of Congress. Unless you think that that oversight is superficial or not particularly robust, before I left, I had a little tally done of how many interactions we had with the Hill, because frankly, it felt like a lot. And over the year before I left, we tabulated that it was more than 500 formal interactions with the Hill. Now, by formal interactions, I mean formal presentations or written product. That doesn't count all the times a staff director would call me up or a member of Congress would call me up and ask a question on the phone, which of course doesn't get recorded in that tally. 500 engagements with the Hill. So that's the Congress. And outside the Congress, of course, you have the judiciary. As I mentioned earlier, there's a court called the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, which oversees application of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, FISA. And much has been made of that court and whether it's a real court or a rubber stamp. But, and I'm happy to get into more discussion about this, but I think the case can be made that it is anything but a rubber stamp. It may not be perfect, but a number of the decisions of that court are now public. And when the government has made mistakes, you can see how harsh that court has been on the executive branch. They are Article 3 judges, just like the district and appellate judges many of you appear before every day. And if you've appeared before an Article 3 judge, they control their part of the world. And that's true in the FISC as well as the district courts. So anyway, those layers is what I refer to as the regulated environment in which NSA has to operate.
So let's talk a little bit about Snowden, or more particularly, let's talk about post-Snowden. And let's talk about the ways in which the Snowden revelations have netted out for American national security and possibly also for American justice. Some people see in the recent legislation that Congress got through some progress, let's say, on the metadata program on 215, but obviously security officials are eager to point out the harms that the Snowden revelations have done or arguably done to security. So what's your overall take on what the Snowden revelations have meant for the well-being of the country?
I think increased public discussion is certainly a good thing. And then the question is, at what cost and in what manner? And one of the great untold stories will be the cost of the Snowden affair. And I say untold for a variety of reasons. One, the actual operational harm is something that is quite difficult to talk about publicly, because if one articulates what it is that the national security community is seeing, those harms are only amplified. So to be very specific, at the level of detail the government has articulated is, we saw very specific targets, largely in the counterterrorism realm, making very specific reference to specific material leaked by Edward Snowden and changing the way they communicate. It's that simple. So that's operational harm. There's not a whole lot of dialogue that can happen with the public on that front. Maybe if there's a trial someday, some of that will emerge. But I think some of the less told harms have to do with diplomatic harm. So you've seen the US's relations with other countries roiled by some of the Snowden revelations, accurate or not. Nevertheless, they've happened. And one can have various perspectives on that. One could suggest, well, the government undertook these activities, so it's not the person who revealed its fault that the government is suffering these repercussions. Regardless of whether one buys that line of argument, think about this. It was one person that made that decision for all of you, for all of us, me included. I would hope you wouldn't think I have the authority to make that decision in a democracy. Little old me as the GC at one agency, I would think we wouldn't want any government worker on their own to make that diplomatic judgment on behalf of all of us. So there's diplomatic harm. I think the third prong is economic harm or potential economic harm in some of the backlash we've seen against primarily US technology companies, but a range of other companies as well, based on a false perception that those companies are somehow less secure than their foreign competitors. Now, I think that dynamic is largely a reflection of pre-existing protectionist rhetoric that existed abroad. We have the best technology in the world, by and large. But it's yet to be seen how long-lasting that impact will be on the US economy. And then finally, I think it is hard to quantify this harm, such as it is, but I think the inflammatory nature of the way the Snowden affair played out really set back our collective discussion on cybersecurity, because I think that discussion was moving along, and by discussion I mean the public discussion, the discussion with Congress, the general public narrative. And the more cybersecurity is falsely equated with surveillance and all the negative connotations that these inflammatory revelations had, I think that affects us all, because we need that discussion to move forward in a very thoughtful, constructive way. It does not help for that discussion to be halted, basically.
Well, there certainly is an affinity between surveillance and cyber, beginning with the fact that both of them are housed centrally within the organization at which you served. Let's pivot to the cyber discussion a little bit and talk about the headline the other day about this massive breach at the Office of Personnel Management, OPM, and the leak of upwards of 25 million social security numbers, let's say. First of all, how did this happen? Who's responsible in the sense of where did this hack come from? And who's responsible within the United States government to protect against breaches of this magnitude?
Well, this issue is very personal for many of us. I'm one of the people who got their notice in the mail that whoever the hacker was, of course, the government has not identified, but there's lots of public speculation about it being a Chinese actor, has my information along with many other federal employees. So a few things. I think there's a few themes that come out of the OPM hack that are pretty relevant to private businesses, because it's a lot of the same factors that are at play. And this is irrespective. I have no particular inside knowledge about the OPM hack. I'm just going on what I've read out there, as have you. So factor one is clearly the patchwork of legacy systems that were in place for a lot of this material seems to have been a relevant factor. But what I mean by that is IT technology that is patched together over time as improvements and changes are made. But usually it's the seams between those stages of architecture that create vulnerabilities, like they do in any business. As one goes through a merger, for example, and combines two IT systems, that's the sort of legacy type issue that can lead to vulnerabilities. And some of the public discussion about the OPM hack has indicated that the adversary first moved in through a government contractor, moved into another system that was within OPM, and then from there moved into the security clearance database that was housed at another federal agency. So the problem of legacy systems, I think, is one businesses are struggling with all the time, as is the government. I think the second theme that comes to mind with the OPM hack is the idea that in addition to trying to prevent attacks, a pretty key element now is how quickly can you detect them? Because if we accept the premise that there is no 100% security, then we're really talking about how can one mitigate the harm that results? And if one doesn't know about an adversary in one's systems for 2 months, 3 months, 6 months, the harm can grow exponentially from there. I think 3, we are now moving to a new phase in cybersecurity where it is no longer sufficient to do the old kind of screening for what are called cyber signatures, basically known malicious actors. The name of the game now is knowing or having systems in place that can help alert one to new actors, whether one calls it a 0-day vulnerability, whether one calls it a new signature. And there are lots of technologies and lots of companies out there that are pitching different types of technology to get at yet as of discovered actors. Fundamentally, as with all cyber issues, in my mind, it really comes down to a trust issue. For the government, in this case, it has to do with the trust of employees like me, federal employees, or like I was, or the trust of businesses in the government as a cyber regulator, in this case, or just the public at large, and the trust in the competence of their government. And I think the administration is taking a number of steps to try to build that. The president has ordered a 30-day cybersecurity sprint, for example. And for a private business, that's the name of the game. There is actual economic harm that happens from a hack, but clearly the reputational trust issues are the existential ones, as Raj Cohen mentioned at lunch today.
So let's talk some more about the private side of the cyber issue and the relationship between public and private actors. If there's one great big theme, I think, that emerges in all discussions of cybersecurity nowadays, it's the idea that public and private entities will have to collaborate to produce this kind of security, that it can't be like a national security good of the sort that the United States government provided in the Cold War, a nuclear umbrella. That's obviously a public good. This is a public-private good. So in light of the Sony hack, the Anthem hack, the Target hack, we could go on and on and on. What role is there for government, as you conceive it, to prevent these hacks and also to do some of the work in the aftermath of their damage?
Well, that is definitely the pressing issue of the day. And I think in order to have a coherent and thoughtful view about the relationship between government and the private sector here, it's helpful to step back and understand what's the nature of the threat, the cyber threat. How has it evolved over the past few years? And I think there's probably 4, in my mind, I think of it as 4 major stages. We're entering stage 4. So stage 1, for lack of a better word, and I'm paraphrasing, frankly, what some other leaders have said as well. My former boss, General Alexander, the director of NSA, and others. Phase 1, for short, we would call exploitation. Stealing, basically. Stealing IP. That's been around for a while, at least a decade. Everyone was attuned to that threat long ago. That's layer 1. But frankly, that's today the equivalent of a mugging on the street, the kind of low-level, unsophisticated crime. It can be sophisticated, of course, but that is the most elemental level of threat. What I would call phase 2, for short, disruption. You had exploitation and then disruption. And by disruption, I mean the sorts of attacks we all saw on Wall Street, 2011, 12, 13. What we saw was a foreign adversary, not publicly identified by the government, but lots of public speculation, that basically impacted a lot of the major banks and froze their public websites for various amounts of time. In other words, didn't really do a whole lot of damage, but really messed with their public-facing interface. Exploitation, disruption. I think phase 3, I would call destruction. Exploitation, disruption, destruction. Now, the most famous examples of destruction are the attack on the Saudi Aramco oil company, in which some 30,000 computers were just destroyed. I mean, bricked, meaning no access, all data wiped. They're as good as garbage at that point. 30,000 computers. Another example, the attack on the Sands Casino in Vegas, whenever that was, that must have been 2014 or so. Similar sort of destructive attack, not the same scale, but same in kind. And then, of course, the one that we're all most familiar with within the last year, the Sony attack. Now, most of what we read and gathered the most press was about salacious emails being released and IP being stolen. But it's also been publicly acknowledged that there were a number of computers, some 8,000, that were destroyed in that attack. So that destructive activity I would consider layer 3 in this evolving threat. And I think layer 4, kind of where we're headed, is what I would call, for lack of a better word, manipulation. Exploitation, disruption, destruction, manipulation. And by manipulation, I mean no longer just stealing something, no longer messing around with the system, no longer just destroying a system, but fiddling around with what's in it so that one loses confidence in the entire system, whether that's data integrity, messing around with the numbers in a bank account, to use probably the most obvious example, or it could mean using access vectors to take control of actual objects. With the Internet of Things coming online, that's the new sexy topic. That means that all of our daily items, whether they're cars or other vehicles or appliances, have a lot of data, and more importantly than the data they hold, are also windows into control over actual physical objects. So manipulation in lots of different forms, I think, is probably the next layer in this threat. So that gets to the question of what role does government have here? So at NSA, there's actually quite a limited role in some regards. This is an intelligence agency. So I think NSA, in our little world where I was, had a few responsibilities. One was providing intelligence to the rest of the government regarding the nature of the cyber threat. And that intelligence could or could not be passed on to the private sector, generally through the Department of Homeland Security or the FBI. As I mentioned earlier, NSA also has a role in protecting certain communication systems within the government, national security systems. And thirdly, NSA is where a lot of the government's technical expertise resides. And so often I was in the position of thinking through how we could allow NSA personnel to assist DHS or the FBI or others investigating some of the more popularly known breaches that you mentioned within the proper legal framework. So that was a limited role that NSA had. The NSA is just one part of the government. And the major players here, of course there are many, apart from the regulatory agencies, are the Defense Department, of which NSA is a piece, the FBI, which of course has a law enforcement and national security investigative function, and the Department of Homeland Security, which is responsible for federal civilian networks and for being the primary interface with the private sector in terms of intelligence sharing, setting up best practices, and so forth. Now, we are definitely talking about a new paradigm here in terms of where responsibility lies, or at least where the ability to have an actual impact lies. Most of the infrastructure we're talking about is privately held, communications networks, etc. So clearly the primary responsibility is going to be with the private sector, by and large. Now that statement, I think, needs some qualifications. The government is going to be more actively involved depending on the nature of the adversary. If it's a hostile foreign government, of course the government has a particularly heightened interest, as we saw with the Sony attack and the attribution to North Korea. If the information at stake has a particularly collective harm possibility, that may be another instance in which the government may have a particular interest. The OPM hack, obviously that was a government system, but nevertheless the information is relevant to the federal government. Then of course there is a critical infrastructure protection function at the Department of Homeland Security. But if one is a run-of-the-mill business that doesn't necessarily have interaction with the government and isn't necessarily a victim of a foreign government, there's a primary responsibility lays with the private sector. And then the question is, how can the government assist? Whether it's through information sharing, best practices, or regulatory structure.
Well, I think the cane is on its way here, and I think that means that our time is up. But please join me in thanking Rajesh for a very illuminating conversation.